Good evening. Hope you're all well this evening. If you care to sign in so I know who's here, that's fine. If you would rather remain anonymous, that's fine too. I'll be right back. There. So why don't we begin? And I invite you to join me in a gathering prayer. Lord God, we give you thanks for this day, for this moment that brings us together once again as we pondered the sacred words of long ago. We pray that we may do so with open minds and open hearts, that we may grow in wisdom and understanding. Lord, help us to take what insights you are waiting to impart to us and carry them with us into the week ahead. And this we pray that we may in all ways be like your only begotten Son. Amen. Okay. Hello, Leslie and Joe as well, and Tom. And we're going to look this evening. By the way, I can get used to doing Bible study like this, although it is a little chilly. I had to put my sweater on. My understanding is that the weather is going to warm up as we go through the week, and I'm not thrilled about that. I do not like the heat and the humidity. I tell people I'd take winter any day of the week. I don't even mind the snow, except I don't like it on Sunday morning because it's bad for business. But I'm discovering with the live streaming now, we could have a raging blizzard and we'd still be able to hold the worship service. So good things are coming out of all of this craziness. This evening, we're going to look at a parable. And Luke's gospel is really the one that you're going to turn to for parables. Luke has more parables than all of the other gospels. In fact, Luke is the gospel that we turn to for the two most famous of the parables, one being the parable of the prodigal son, and the other one being the parable of the Good Samaritan. So this evening, we're going to look at the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collectors who went up to the temple to pray. And if you do not have the scripture, you can download it by clicking on the link below the screen that you're watching right now. It is Luke 18, verses 9 through 14. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. All righty. So, what are your thoughts regarding this parable? And I'll say that I'm a little in a bit of a quandary because I've got two sermons kicking around in my head, and that's often the case. The two sermons are similar but slightly different. And sometimes I have trouble at the beginning of the formation process, because I really have to choose one or the other rather than trying to make both into one. I remember we had a student minister many years ago, and after she preached one of her first sermons, it didn't go very well. And so as we were talking, I said, well, tell me what the sermon was about, or what you wanted it to be about. And she kept hemming and hawing. I said, I've always felt that if you can't tell me in one sentence what the sermon is about, you're not ready to preach it. And so after she continued to struggle, she finally looked at me and she says, I know what the problem was. And I said, what's that? She said, I was trying to give birth to triplets. And that's very typical when you're just starting out in ministry and you have all of these ideas, so much that you want to say, that you try to cram them all into one sermon. And I remember when I told my father I was going into the ministry, he said, that's great. And then the only other thing he said is, keep your sermons to 20 minutes. If you have to go more than that, save it for another sermon. Well, even today, now, I don't think I could get away with a 20-minute sermon. So let me see, Tom, elevating yourself by saying others are sinners. So that's absolutely one aspect of this parable. You think about it, the Pharisee, he could have gone up there and he could have patted himself on the back. It would have been self-serving. But if you think about it, he could have said, look, I tithe everything that I have, just looking very quickly. And he fasts twice a week. I knew there was something else that he did. So he could have tried to make himself look good by just focusing on those two things. But he didn't. He actually began by putting the tax collector and everybody else down. And I've always said, beware of anyone who can only make themselves look good by making others look bad. And we're seeing a lot of that these days. And I'll just say, enough said on that. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. But the Pharisee, as I said, he could have just tooted his own horns, accentuated the good in himself. But he didn't. He went a step further and he dumped on the tax collector. Seems a bit related to take the plank out of your own eye first parable. We should acknowledge our own sins. And that kind of relates back to last Sunday's sermon about we all need to take sin more seriously and start with our own sin. The one difference between this parable and the take the plank or log out of your own eye, depending on the translation that you use, is that in that saying, at least there's a pretense of wanting to help someone else, even though you're not really looking at your own faults first. But taking the plank out of your own eye first so you can take the speck out of your brother's eye or neighbor's eye, at least there's a pretense of wanting to help. although it can be a put down. You need my help, and so you can't do it yourself, so I'm going to take it out of your eye. In this parable, there's no pretense at all in the Pharisee of wanting to help this tax collector. He's just dumping on him and tooting his own horn. Makes me think of one of my favorite stories about Gregory Peck, the actor. And he and a friend went out to lunch one day in Hollywood at some very exclusive, fancy restaurant. And there was a waiting list. After waiting for a while, the friend said to Gregory Peck, "Why don't you go up there and tell them who you are?" And Gregory Peck replied, "No, if you have to tell them who you are, you aren't." And the fact that this Pharisee has to blow his own horn, maybe he isn't as all that as he thinks he is. The tax collector recognizes his own faults. Do you think the tax collector is dumping on himself a little too much? As a pastor, I can tell you that I often see the extremes when it comes to judging yourself. Some people see themselves as better than they are, and others just see themselves as worse as they are. So in other words, some people don't take their guilt seriously enough, and others take it too seriously to the point where it really isn't doing them any good. The only guilt that is good is guilt that brings about reconciliation and metanoia, which is the Greek word for a change, a turning around. So I sometimes wonder if this tax collector is dumping on himself a little bit too much. There's also something interesting in the story that I never noticed until I just read it a second ago. It says that they went into the temple to pray. Now, other translations that I'm familiar with say that they went up to the temple to pray. Going into the temple to pray caught my attention because it seemed a little strange because of the fact that tax collectors were sometimes Gentiles, but maybe not. Maybe they were Jews and they were collaborators. I was just wondering how the tax collector got into the temple if he wasn't a Jew. But I stand corrected. He very well could have been a Jew who was collaborating. And as we know, tax collectors back then were particularly despised because they were often greedy, and they were considered traitors because they were collaborating with the Romans. So yeah, I think that the tax collector was too harsh on himself. But then again, a parable is often phrased in a way, written in a way that accentuates the disparities, that heightens things so that it makes the point even clearer. And one way in which I'm thinking about going with the sermon is to focus on the power of words, and we're seeing a lot of that right now. I don't know if any of you have listened to the devotional that I posted this evening, but in it, I am reflecting on something that I've been hearing a lot lately. And I don't mean, 30, 40 times, but I've heard it several times over the last couple of weeks. I've heard it said to me personally in a couple of conversations that I've had, and I've seen it in articles that I've read in the newspaper and read online. And it's the statement, all lives matter. And I remember the first time someone said that to me, I felt a little uncomfortable. I felt like something wasn't quite right. And I couldn't figure out why it was troubling me because it's true. In God's eyes, all lives matter. But, and I guess I'm repeating myself because I think I did say this last week, all lives matter, but it allows us to not focus on the other truth that is, in this situation, even more important, which is Black Lives Matter. And as a white man, I have never in my entire life had to wonder if my life mattered to a police officer, to a judge, to a doctor in an emergency room, to anybody in authority. And, words have tremendous power. I love you. Thank you, which we don't say often enough these days. And you can see this by, and it's an illustration I've used from time to time. Notice what happens when you are going into a store and you hold the door for someone, and how often the person will walk by you without even acknowledging that you've held the door for them. And that used to bother me a lot, and I would be tempted to say something sarcastic like, "You're welcome," or, I don't get paid to stand here and hold the door for people. But I realized that that would only make a bad situation worse. And now what I do is I make a preemptive goodness strike. And I do that this way. As I hold the door for the person, I'll say something to them like, "Here, let me get that door for you." And by doing that, I'm making a connection with the person. So it makes it virtually impossible for the person to just walk by with saying, "Oh, thank you." And it works. And on the very rare occasion where it doesn't work, it doesn't bother me because at that point I realize that there's something going on with this person and I'm not going to let it ruin my day. So words have power. And this Pharisee is using his words as a weapon to put down this tax collector. And I think with everything that's going on now, it's making us realize that as people of faith, we have to be very careful in the use of our words. And I know it gets some people really riled up, particularly because of political correctness. We shouldn't call God Father because God is neither male nor female. And I understand that, yet at the same time, I know that Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane said, "Abba, Father." Abba is Aramaic. It almost is like saying daddy. I'll give you another example of the power of words. And I think I'm going to include this in the sermon. I had at one point 3 mothers, all living at the same time. Because I was adopted, I had the woman who gave birth to me. That's one mother. A second mother is the woman who adopted me. And then because my adopted parents were divorced and my father remarried, I had my stepmother. So I had 3 mothers which is why I used to tell people that Mother's Day was a financial killer for me. But it also created difficulties for people because when I would be talking to them, if I would say, my mother did this, or my mother sent me that, or I was talking on the phone to my mother, people would have to stop and say, well, which mother are you talking about? Because they wouldn't know which one. And sometimes they would say things like, now, is this your biological mother? And I would have to correct them politely, and I would say, no, this is my birth mother. Because think about it, if you say, is this your biological mother? It could suggest that the only relationship that this woman had with me was the act of giving birth. And that definitely isn't the case. As some of you know, I did my doctoral research on search and reunion of adoptees. And in talking to women who had given birth to a child and given them up for adoption, 20, 30 or more years later, they would be sharing their story with me and still be in tears. So I would say, no, this isn't my biological mother, it's my birth mother. Or another way they would say it is this your natural mother or your real mother? And I would say, no, because if this is my natural mother, does that mean that my adopted mother was my unnatural mother? Or that my adopted mother was my unreal mother? And words, they can be very powerful and contain messages below the surface. I'm just going to stop here. So, answer your question, Leslie. Yes, the tax collectors uh, actually collected more than they were supposed to, in the sense that the way it worked back then was the Roman Empire was divided up into districts, and each district had a tax collector. You bid to be the tax collector of a district. So you bid X amount of money. And if you bid the most, then Rome appointed you as the tax collector. So Rome got money that way. Then, in addition to that, Rome set a levy of tax revenue that you were supposed to raise and send to Rome. And the key, though, was that there was just a bottom amount, a minimum that had to be raised. Anything that you brought in above that, you got to keep. And so there was an incentive to gouge people and to abuse them. So again, words can be healing, words can be hurtful. And what we're seeing now is this being played out in a way that we haven't seen in this country in a long, long time. And many people in the civil rights movement, veterans, and others are saying that this time it seems to be different. And I certainly hope that is the case. And again, we as people of faith, I was just thinking, I was adopted and have two siblings who were also adopted. And I guess that doesn't really make a difference in what I'm about to say, but I was the oldest, am the oldest. And I never liked that because parents are stricter on the oldest than the ones that come after. And that actually is even more so in families where the children are adopted in this way. Because of society's prejudices, not so much today, but back in the 60s when I was growing up, there was definitely a prejudice against adoption and adoptees and parents who had to adopt. When you think about it, if a child is a gift from God and a couple can't have a child, then there's an implicit, at least back then, an implicit belief that somehow you were being judged by God as not worthy of having children. And I know it sounds strange today, but in all my research, this is absolutely true. And so, what would often happen, or sometimes happen anyways, is that adopted parents would feel that they had to raise the perfect children and have the perfect family to prove to everyone that they could be just as good at being parents as everyone else. And that was the case. And now you've got to get me back on track because I've lost my train of thought. Um, People of faith need to be careful when it comes to our words. So, I know from my own experience what words can do. As a pastor, I've also learned that that is very true, especially because I am a pastor. I remember many years ago, I was talking to somebody, and I don't know if it was a parishioner, it might have been. I just remember making a comment about something, or whether it's something that they had done or whatever. And I thought it was a very innocuous statement, a comment. But as soon as I said it, I could see the hurt in the person's eyes. And suddenly I realized that because I'm a pastor, what I say can, rightly or wrongly, just the reality, can carry more weight than someone else. So, for example, in this situation, I remember reflecting on it later and thinking, if somebody who wasn't a pastor had said this, the person might have shrugged it off. But because I said it, it had more clout in a negative way in this situation. So I'm also very careful about what I say. That's why some of the things that we see coming out of Washington from various people trouble me, because when you're a public person, you don't have the freedom to simply speak your mind as you wish. And without getting political, that was what made me so uncomfortable with the whole discussion over hydroxychloroquine. It was being touted as a way of protecting yourself against this COVID-19, and yet the science on it wasn't there. And so words can hurt, but they can also heal. Here's where I am struggling. You can't, here we go. Let me see here. You can't unsay words. That's a good point. It's why I don't have a Facebook page. Um, I I do believe in social media, but I also believe that it is a Pandora's box. And once you say something online, you can't take it back. And how often are we seeing today people posting things online and then deleting the posts? But it's too late. And that gets us back to the words. So many instances over the last 3 weeks of people posting things online and then deleting them because they never should have said them in the first place. And the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee is a reminder that we have to be careful with our words. And so, in that respect, a lot of what's happening right now, I think is great because we need to understand and take seriously the power of words. Here's something else, and this is where the two sermons are kind of intertwined. So the Pharisee, he's trying to make himself look better by dumping on the tax collector. And he's comparing himself to the tax collector. I got thinking about that today and how dangerous it is to compare yourself with others. Uh, there's a line in the reading Desiderata, and it goes something like this: do not compare yourself with others, for always there will be those who are greater and lesser than yourself. And comparing is a dangerous game. Um, and yet we do it all the time. You know, when you're at a gathering, what is one of the first questions that somebody will ask you after, say, your name? Any guesses? It's one of the first things that will come up in a conversation at a gathering with someone you don't know or someone who doesn't know you. Any guesses? Tell you what, I'm going to type it in myself. There you go. There's the answer right there. Beat you, Leslie. But yes, that is the answer. What do you do for work? And it's a general conversation question, but if you think about it, there's more to the question than just casual getting to know you. That's a way of comparing ourselves with one another. It's a way of establishing almost a pecking order. Tony Campolo tells this wonderful story, and he's a Christian author and sociologist. And he used to go to all of these gatherings with his wife, and eventually his wife stopped going, and he asked her why. And she told him that when she went to these gatherings, there were a lot of high-powered people, lawyers, doctors, theologians, and whatnot. And inevitably, they would say, "What do you do?" And she would feel self-conscious because she would say, "Oh, I'm just a housewife." And so Tony Campolo told her, the next time somebody asks you what you do at one of these gatherings, um, spruce it up a little bit, jazz it up a little bit. And so when it happened, this woman asked his wife, "What do you do?" And she said something, I don't remember the exact words, but it was something to the effect of, I am a domestic engineer involved in a sociological experiment on raising two Homo sapiens in the prevailing ethos of the Judeo Christian faith. And there was a lot more to it. She went on for a while. And when she got finished, the woman who asked said, "Oh, I'm just a lawyer." So, again, words being used, but comparing ourselves with each other is dangerous because either we'll put someone down or we'll be jealous because we're not as good as that person or we don't have what that person has. And I got thinking of myself, how do we avoid this comparing that is so dangerous? Yeah, Leslie, if you shoot me an email, I will send you the exact quote from Tony Campolo's wife. I've got it in a sermon somewhere, and like I say, it goes on for a while, and it's quite comical. Um, so, how do we avoid this unhealthy comparing? And I don't think we can eliminate it completely. I think it's ingrained into us, but I think I have a way of comparing that redeems it and makes it much more healthy and much more faithful. How do we as people of faith avoid the comparing that is damaging, destructive? Hello, Charlene. Welcome. I think of a great story in the Old Testament, and even there's an example of words that can be loaded. Okay, Old Testament. We think of old as passe. Look at advertising, new and improved. Well, old in this case doesn't mean less than. That's why some prefer to call the Old Testament simply the Hebrew Scriptures. So, in this particular story that I'm thinking about, the Jews have returned from exile in Babylon after Nebuchadnezzar conquers the southern kingdom and Jerusalem falls. All the people, anybody who's anybody, is hauled off to Babylon. It's called the Babylonian captivity or the Babylonian exile. Lasts about 80 years. Then the Babylonians are defeated by the Persians. The Persian Emperor Cyrus issues an edict. And by the way, in the book of Nehemiah, I think he's called God's anointed, which is really interesting because the Hebrew word for anointed is Messiah. So here you have this Persian emperor who is the Messiah of the Jewish people. Obviously, Messiah with a small m. So Cyrus issues an edict, says all the Jews can go back to Jerusalem. It was a miracle. Not all of them went back, which is why there was, until a number of years ago, a sizable Jewish community in modern Iraq. They get back to Jerusalem, they have to rebuild the city, and they rebuild the temple. But the temple, this is the second temple. The first temple was built by Solomon. Because they've just returned from exile, the resources are limited. It is a much smaller temple. And some of the people who remember the first temple are weeping because this temple doesn't even begin to compare with the first temple. And, I look at that story and I think, look at the comparing and what it's doing to them. They've just experienced a miracle. They've returned home. They're free. And yet, because they're comparing, they can't see the blessings that they have. And that's the danger of comparing. Either you're going to put someone down or, you're not going to be as good as so-and-so. So how do we overcome this human tendency to compare? And by the way, ministers are as guilty of it as anybody. It's one of the reasons why I never liked going to clergy gatherings, because everybody will be tooting their own horn. Oh, I baptized this many people, and oh, you know what, we just raised X number of dollars for a new education wing or whatever. And as I was reading the parable today, what I realized is that the Pharisee made a mistake when it came to comparing. He was comparing himself to this tax collector. What he should have been doing is comparing himself to God. Or for us as Christians, maybe the thing that we should do is, instead of comparing ourselves to each other, we compare ourselves to Jesus. Because when we do that, we all understand that we don't measure up to him. And that is the great equalizer. So instead of saying, I'm better than this person, or, I'm not as good as that person, I compare myself to Jesus, and suddenly we're all less than, but equally loved. And that, I think, is where I'm going with the sermon. Instead of comparing ourselves with each other, we compare ourselves with the Christ who came to dwell among us, full of grace and truth. And got a little work to do on the sermon, but I think there's a kernel of divine grace there. We'll have to wait and see how things go on Sunday. I'll work on the sermon tomorrow. And any parting comments or questions? And Charlene, better late than never. And one of the great things about the online Bible study is you can go back and you can watch the recording of it, which also allows you to skip over the parts where I'm particularly boring. Wait just a second to see if there's any more comments here. And by the way, I always say you're free to disagree with me. I have been wrong on many an occasion. Yes, Charlene, that's exactly my point. If we all compared ourselves to Jesus, then we would be less likely to look down on others. And yeah, Jesus, I I'm not going to pretend that I'm as smart as him or as good as him. Um, and this is actually very helpful. When you do that, when you compare yourself to him instead of everybody else, it makes you humble. And it's better to be humbled by him than to be humbled by taking a tumble because you run into somebody who is smarter or richer or more popular. Yep. You don't have to bring someone down to build yourself up. Uh, Variation on, I think, what I said earlier. I always say, beware of anyone who can only make themselves look good by making others look bad. And sadly, we have much too much of that going on right now. And, I go back to what I began with about all lives matter. Yeah, that's true. But it's a way of avoiding the reality that for people of color, they live with the reality at various points in their life. They've experienced that their lives don't matter. And so, no, I don't want to hear all lives matter because right now I need to have a level playing field. And I want to live in a country where the playing field is level. And in order for that, I need to look at myself. I need to stop being that Pharisee and saying, well, that person over there or this person over there. I need to look at myself and say, how do I live my life in ways that contribute to Black lives not mattering? I need to look at myself. And I don't consider myself a prejudiced person, but I have to admit that, yeah, there is at times a little bit of prejudice here and there. And maybe it's also there in my failures to speak up or to act up. And, Martin Luther King Jr. said once that sometimes the only thing it takes for bad men to succeed is for good men and women to do nothing. So I thank you all. As always, this is a joy for me, and you do help with the sermon. And so I thank you, and God bless. I'm looking forward to when we'll be able to be with each other again. Night, everyone.